Rado is a company with a long history of innovation, not so much in terms of their movements or what drives their watches, but more in terms of their design, and particularly in terms of the materials that they use to make up their bracelets and their watch cases. Rado began in 1957, but is today part of the Swatch group of watches. Rado has a lot of firsts. They produced the world's first fully ceramic watch, the Ceramica, in 1990. It had a ceramic bracelet and a case that are of course very highly resistant to scratches. They continue to innovate with new materials such as hardened titanium, which is harder than regular titanium and more scratch resistant, and also plasma forged ceramic. That is actually heated to 20,000 degrees Celsius in order to give the hardness and scratch resistance of regular ceramic, but it has the shine of metal without, of course, actually using any metal. They have also produced the hardest watch in the world, and it's coated in synthetic diamonds. One of the original Rado watches was the Daya Star of 1962. This is a re-release of that original from 2012 that was produced to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the 1962 model. This is a limited edition of 1,962 pieces in reference to the original year 1962. The watch comes in a rather retro-inspired box and also includes a rather cool pair of nifty cufflinks. I just want to take a second to look at the cufflinks that come with the watch. They come in this nice little box that's part of the larger watch box. And you'll notice that they are highly polished, just like the watch itself. And they also have the Rado anchor logo that spins around on them just like it does on the dial of the watch. They're also nicely engraved with Rado and the anchor logo around their outer circumference there. So rather nice little cufflinks. It's nice to get a little gift with your limited edition watch. Back in the 1950s and early 60s, the idea of a sports watch was still a relatively new concept. Rolex, Blancpain and Zodiac had only just produced the first stainless steel dive watches that we very much take for granted today. In fact, back then, the only materials used for watch cases were either stainless steel or a precious metal, usually gold. The large shield-like case on this watch is not made of steel or gold. It's made of a newer, never-before-seen case material called tungsten carbide. Tungsten carbide is a dense, heavy metal mixture of carbon and tungsten. It was previously only used by the machining industry to make extremely hard tools. That is, of course, before Rado got their hands on it. To turn tungsten carbide into a watch case, Rado had to first fuse tungsten and carbon together at pressures over 1,000 times that of our own atmosphere and at temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius. The end product is one of the hardest metals that humanity has ever produced. It is roughly 10 times harder than the usual 316L stainless steel that most watch cases are made out of. Rado was in fact so confident in the hardness of this new material that it advertised this watch as the world's first scratch-proof watch. The funny thing is that when you come across vintage examples of Daya Stars, they look brand new. They don't have a single scratch on them because that tungsten carbide that goes into that shield-like case is so much harder than anything else that the watch is likely to come into contact with. If we look at the design of this watch, you can of course see that really characteristic shield shape to the case. This is something that hasn't really been copied or replicated since on a watch, and it's really unique to the Rado Diastar. I think that the shape is as much to do with the case material as anything else. The tungsten carbide, I believe, proved to be quite difficult to work with. Because it's such a hard material, it was very difficult to shape, and so they ended up producing this unusual shield shape with it just because they were limited in what they could actually do with the material. The lugs are also hidden. It's got a lugless type design. The bracelet just goes straight into the case of the watch, which I think adds to that kind of shield shape or UFO-like appearance of the watch. You don't have lugs sticking out and spoiling that very iconic shield shape. The dial itself is very cool. It's very three-dimensional. It's very deep. If you look at the applied hour indices, you'll see that they're actually very three-dimensional little metallic blocks. They're very wedge-shaped, and on the top of each one you have a little circular dot of superluminova. The dial itself has a very nice vertical brushing to it. Very subtle vertical brushing there, and you'll see that the Rado and Daya Star text is applied to the dial. It's not painted on, it is applied metallic logos. And of course you'll see that anchor logo there in the red circle that rotates around. It's actually mounted on a pinion on a jewel, and it is able to rotate around with the movement of the watch, just as the rotor does in the movement. There is also a date window at 3 o'clock there on the right hand side of the dial, and you'll see that the hands are very flat, very rectangular metallic hands. They reflect the light nicely, and they do both the hour and minute hands have a strip of superluminova up the center of them. I say they're flat, but depending on how you look at it, they do perhaps have a slight curve to them. They're not strictly flat. To my eyes, they have a little bit of a curve. You'll also see that the running seconds hand is black and has a rectangular square shape in the center there where it attaches to the central pinion of the watch. I'd also like to point out that this watch has a sapphire crystal. Now, we've come to expect sapphire crystals as pretty much standard these days because they provide that scratch resistance. This was another Rado first. Prior to this, all watches either had acrylic crystal or regular glass over their dials, and the Rado Diastar was in fact one of the first watches to use a synthetic sapphire crystal over the dial. Another couple of things I would like to point out are that on the side of the case opposite to the crown, there's a very nicely done, very deeply engraved Rado text. And on the crown itself, you can also just see that it is a signed crown that has the Rado anchor on the end of it. If we look at the back plate of this watch, you can see a few rather interesting things. First of all, you'll notice that there's an etching round that back plate saying limited edition, and this is number 1430 of the 1962 that will be produced. Again, that 1962 is in reference to the original year of the Daya Star. You'll also notice that on the back plate we have Rado, Daya Star, Swiss, with the serial number, and then it says scratch proof, water sealed. So this was quite common at the time to say, well, this is a water sealed watch, it has some water resistance, but this was again the first watch in the world to ever say scratch proof, again because of that really hard tungsten carbide material that the case is made out of. So Rado marketed this watch as the world's first scratch proof watch. The movement in this watch is the ETA 2836-2. So that's a Swiss-made ETA movement. ETA is making movements as part of the Swatch group. It has 25 jewels. It has 3 hands, the hour, minute, and running seconds. It also has a quick set date function, meaning that when you pull the crown out to the first position, you can advance the date. It also has hacking seconds, meaning that when you pull the crown out to the second position, the seconds hand will stop, and so you can set the watch more precisely. And the movement vibrates at 28,800 vibrations per hour. I always mention the vibrations per hour of a movement because it relates to precision. 28,800 vibrations per hour is a fairly common rate, and it means that the watch ticks 8 times per second. So if you were to zoom in and slow down that seconds hand, you would see that it's actually moving 8 times every second. Rates can be lower than this. They can be 18,000 vibrations per hour or 5 ticks per second, or higher than this at 36,000 vibrations per hour or 10 beats per second. Higher rates may equate to greater accuracy, all other things being equal, but they do certainly mean that the seconds hand sweeps more smoothly across the dial. The 28,800 of this watch is fairly common, and it's a respectable vibration rate, and you'll see that if you look at the seconds hand, it's sweeping fairly smoothly, very nicely gliding around the dial. The bracelet on this watch is also very nice. It's a retro styled bracelet, very much like what you would have seen on the original watch. It's what's termed a Novavit style bracelet, as they were the company that originally produced this style of bracelet. And you'll see that it has a spring buckle and pushers, so a very nice positive click to the clasp or buckle. It's got 2 pushers either side that you have to depress to disengage the locking mechanism, and you'll notice that the buckle is signed with an etching of Rado and the anchor logo among horizontal striping there, and that's again very much like it would have been on the original bracelet. So overall the design of this watch is really nice. It's very true to the original in terms of size and design and colouring, even down to the very small details like the applied rotating anchor logo, the hands of the watch, the face and dial of the watch, and even the text that's on the watch. The Rado and Daya Star text are absolutely identical to how they would have been on the original watch from 1962. Rado is still making these original styled Daya Star watches in silver and PVD coated gold colours with varied complications. Most can be had for less than $1,000, and these represent a hell of a value proposition given their history, the design and the materials, as well as having solid Swiss made movements inside. Here's the watch on my rather hairy, about 7-inch or 18cm circumference wrist. The watch itself is 35mm across. It's 42.5mm from top to bottom, or from lug to lug, top to bottom of the shield case there, and it's 11.9mm thick. So it is again a very retro watch. It is a reissue of that original, and it's sized like the original. So this may be a little bit on the small side for some of you watching this, but it is very true to the original, and I don't find it too small on my 7-inch wrist. There is a huge trend toward vintage inspired watches or reissues of old models going on in the watch industry right now. It's like a lot of companies have discovered their old catalogues and their parts bins and said, hey, this old stuff is pretty cool. Watch collectors and consumers seem to be loving this trend too, as some of the most popular new watches are actually based on old ones. Now, let's pair this watch with a Scotch. I'm pairing the Rado Diastar with Johnnie Walker Black Label. But before I get into why, let's talk a wee bit about the whiskey. Black Label has been around for over 100 years. You can see here on the bottle that Johnnie Walker and Sons was established in Kilmarnock in 1820. Black Label hasn't been around quite that long, but it's still a well-established blend. The whiskey is a blended Scotch, meaning that it's made up of around 40 different whiskies. Some of those are cheaper grain type whiskies, and then there's a mixture of more expensive single malts, the core of which is perhaps the greatest whisky ever made, the Talisker. All of these whiskies must be at least 12 years old, and they all originate in Scotland. You can see immediately that this Scotch is one of my favourites, judging by the almost empty bottle that I have here. But let's smell the whisky first of all. It's got a lovely vanilla smell, a little bit of peatiness and some saltiness, and a little bit of citrus. Let's look at the colour of the whisky and its legs. You can see here in the glass that it's got a lovely dark caramel colour. It's lovely and thick. If we look at the legs that are going to flow back down the side of the glass there, again we tilt the glass so the whisky can flow up the sides, and then we look at where it flows to, and we wait for those legs, those little droplets of whisky, to start running back down the inside of the glass. And when we look at those on this Scotch, we can see that they're thick, they're slow moving. That tells you it's an old whisky, it's matured well. Now let's taste the whisky. It's got a lovely caramel taste to it. It's a little bit sweet, a little bit malty, and some spiciness. The finish, what you notice after you've swallowed the Scotch, has some peatiness and quite a bit of smokiness. Perhaps there's a little bit of saltiness there, and even perhaps a little touch of licorice taste. It's silky smooth and it lasts for a very long time. The trick is that this is a mixture of 40 different whiskies, and yet it must produce a consistent blend every single time. Johnnie Walker Black always tastes like Johnnie Walker Black, whether you're drinking it now or you're drinking it 100 years ago or 100 years in the future, or whether you're in New York or you're in Tokyo, it doesn't matter. This is always consistently good and always tastes the same. And it's that consistency that is key. It really speaks to the skill of the master blender when you've got so many different whiskies in the mix. This, I think, is why Black Label may be the best value for money whiskey in the world. It's a complex yet incredibly consistent and supremely good whiskey that won't break the bank. That's why I've paired the Daya Star with Black Label. The value and consistency are both there. Just like Black Label, the Daya Star is great value, and it will stay consistent in its appearance thanks to its advanced materials. So do we call this a reissue or a tribute to the original? You know, I'm not really sure. I think that what we've got here is faithful to the 1962 model in terms of design, materials, and even size, which is not often the case with reissues in today's ever-trending larger watch world. But I think that the original was ahead of its time, and when I look at this one, I see a watch that has elements that can be considered out of the ordinary even today. This is a watch that feels retro, yet futuristic. This is a watch that may not be for everyone, but it's a design that hasn't been copied or done to death. It still looks as cool as it did in 1962, and thanks to the tungsten carbide, it will still look cool in 2062, and that's why I love it. What do you think about the Rado Diastar? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, do please like and subscribe.